So now we get to another excitable tissue, which is the nervous tissue. So we had seen that in the muscular tissue already, where we can stimulate the cells and they actually give you some sort of type of response. And now what we're going to see is with the nervous system, we're going to stimulate it and it's going to receive those signals and then it's going to produce a signal of its own. So remember that when we were talking about the muscular system, we talked about different types of changes in membrane potential, and that was the way that it got stimulated, that it relayed the signal along the length of the particular cell. And so now we're going to see that as well with the nervous system. So this will be another system where it does get down to the molecular level, even the chemical level, even ionic level, things like that. We don't have to go subatomic particles, but we are going to find that that's how we're going to understand how these neurons do their job. Just like muscle cells, their main job was to contract. Neurons are going to receive and send signals. So it's pretty simple in terms of what they do, but it's a little bit more complex when you get into the details of it. Okay, so the system overall, right, is going to be our puppet master, if you will, controlling and coordinating and communicating with all different aspects of the body. And so, like we were talking about, we're going to be seeing signals, electrochemical signals. Now, when we say electrochemical, what that means is we're going to be moving charged particles. So it's chemical because we're moving chemicals, ions, etc. But it's electrical because those chemicals have a charge to them, right? So ions have a charge, depending on whether they have lost or gained an electron. So much like we saw for the muscular system. Okay, so when we look at the functions, what we find is that there's going to be three major functions. One is going to be sensory input, so we're going to be getting information from the body, telling it what's going on, telling it what's going on outside of the body as well. So it makes us sensitive to our environment. We've got to integrate that information as well. We've got to figure out, what does that mean to me? How is that important in terms of maintaining homeostasis, etc.? And then how are we going to respond to it? So if we need to respond to it, how are we going to do that? So usually we're going to have effectors that are going to produce an effect if we, if you will, decide consciously or subconsciously to respond to it. So that's what we see here. So for instance, if we are thirsty, right? And in fact, if we're thirsty, that could have to do with seeing some sort of drink, but it could also have to do with our reflexes in terms of monitoring homeostasis. So we have monitoring of our different bodily fluids and our blood pressure and things like that. And so as we get a response where maybe our fluid volume is getting low in the body, and this is the response. Our thirst receptors and blood pressure receptors and things like that are going to give us some information. We're going to integrate that information, and then we're going to produce a response. In this case, a voluntary response, trying to integrate, or if you will, not integrate, but initiate some drinking so that we can increase our fluid intake, so we can increase our fluid volume. All right, so if we look at the system overall, it's divided into two different parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system structurally are separate, and then functionally they're related but also separate. So for instance, the central nervous system with its brain and spinal cord is the main integration control center. So it's the area where we're making decisions, and even the spinal cord itself can do that. So, right, it's interpreting, like we mentioned, sensory input, and then it is dictating or basically producing a response, sending it out to our effectors. But even though the central nervous system dictates that motor response or that output, it's going to go out through the peripheral nervous system. And so the peripheral nervous system is going to get it out to wherever that effector is. So, central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord, right? Peripheral nervous system is everywhere else, communicating with, to and from, if you will, the central nervous system. So cranial nerves extending in and around the head and neck and even into the torso, spinal nerves going out to and from the spinal cord and going to the rest of the body, and even these ganglia, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so when we look at this system, right, brain and spinal cord, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at that when we get into the system overall. We'll even talk about the nerves and how they're kind of two-way streets. But when we look at that peripheral nervous system, we're going to have two different divisions based on, like we said, it being a two-way street. Information coming in, this is called sensory information, also known as afferent or afferent information coming in. And then there is motor or efferent information going out. So if you look at the first letter of these terms, you can see how that spells same, right? Sensory, afferent, motor, efferent. So when we talk about the sensory coming in, and I'll show you, there's a figure that we see here that actually has our different aspects of the nervous system, and it's a little bit small, but what you can see is the blue arrows are going into the central nervous system, right? And then the pink arrows are coming out. So we have the sensory division, which is going to be somatic and visceral sensory fibers. So when we look at it, right, the somatic ones are coming, soma means body, we're going to see that again. So soma means body. This is kind of coming from the body, right? From the skin, from the skeletal muscles, from the body itself, if you will. This is going to be more of a conscious level information coming in. And then visceral, right? Viscera means guts. And so this is going to be coming from the interior. Oh, the stomach is full, if you will. This is even before it becomes conscious. Like we said, blood pressure receptors, things like that. So that's the sensory input that's coming in. Then the central nervous system has to figure out what to do with it. And then it's going to have some sort of a response. So the response goes out, again, through the peripheral nervous system. So you can see how that's a two-way street, both sensory coming through it and then motor coming out of it. And the motor division splits into two types. Again, we see somatic, and then we see a different one that's called autonomic. So somatic, that we see over here again, is more the voluntary part. So again, like going to the skeletal muscles in order to get them to contract, like we talked about before at the neuromuscular junction. Autonomic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system is more like the automatic nervous system. It controls, it's still controlling and coordinating, but it's doing so on a subconscious level. So think about our other types of muscle, right? Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, which is involuntary but still controlled. Glands like salivary glands and sweat glands and things like that. Now, with the autonomic nervous system, that ANS that we see here, it also has two separate divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic and parasympathetic, it's not that you feel bad for somebody or something like that, or twice as bad. In this case, what we're talking about is these are two sides, if you will, of the coin. It's kind of like the gas pedal and the brake that work to control those, if you will, automatic responses, like, for instance, the heart. So the heart rate going up and increasing or slowing down. And so sympathetic is going to have one response. In this case, like with the heart, it's going to increase the heart rate, maybe increase the contraction strength, whereas the parasympathetic is going to slow it down. So again, it's like the gas pedal and the brake. So we'll see, there's a whole lecture on that, and we'll see that in terms of the autonomic nervous system and how it controls all these different organs. But we'll see that just in a little bit, after central nervous system, etc. Okay? Okay, so let's get down to the nervous cells that make up the nervous tissue. So when we look at it, there's two different cell types there. There are the neuroglia, or the glial cells, and so they kind of have different pronunciations depending on what you call them, but it's the same cells. These are support cells. So we'll see that structurally and functionally, these are supporting the other cell type, which are the neurons. So the neurons are the actual nerve cells, and these are the ones that are going to be transmitting signals. All right, so let's take a look at these neuroglia. And so there are different types of support cells in the central nervous system and in the peripheral nervous system. So in the central nervous system, we've got four different types. We've got what are called astrocytes. You can imagine those look like stars. We have These other ones, which are, hold on, it's coming up, microglia. So you imagine those are going to be somewhat small. Ependymal cells, which you probably have no idea as to a hint for that name. And then the oligodendrocytes, same type of thing. So those are the 4 different types of support cells that we have in the central nervous system. Now, where's the central nervous system again? Brain and spinal cord. So these are going to be support cells found in the brain and spinal cord. So if we have 4 different types of cells, you would imagine we've got 4 different, again, structure and function type relationships. They're not going to be all exactly the same. So the astrocytes are going to be the most abundant ones. They have the quite a variety of different functions, and they are found kind of attaching to these neurons as well as near what we call the synaptic endings. The synapse is, we saw this in the muscular system, right, in the neuromuscular junction. The synapse is the gap that exists between these 2 excitable cells. So functions, look at all those functions, right? Support and brace neurons. So they give a structural framework and kind of hold these synapses together and hold these neurons together that need to communicate. They do some exchanges between the capillaries in the neurons in terms of specific ions and potentially nutrients and things like that. During formation and development, they help to guide connections between young neurons. They control, like we were talking about in terms of exchanges, they also control the chemical environment. So they may take up some of the chemicals or even the waste products from the neurons. Respond to nerve impulses and neurotransmitters. Now they respond to it, they are responsive to it, but they're not going to be transmitting signals like throughout the body, like we talked about the neurons doing. Influence neuronal functioning. There are some slight effects of that. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And then participate in information processing in the brain too. Some of those last couple are actually new functions that they found even within the last 10 years or so. But you can see they're definitely star-shaped, and you can see how they form a lot of the structural relationships here, right? So you can see how they have these foot-like processes that are holding on to neurons, so shown in yellow there. In this case, holding on to capillaries and helping to form what's called this blood-brain barrier. But they also can physically help to create kind of a filtration. You see those gaps right there? So that helps to create a filter. So they are found all over the place. We said very numerous and very different types of functions that we can see ascribed to the astrocytes. All right, microglia. These are going to be the small ones. These ones are phagocytes. So what we have is we have an immune system, a bodily defense that protects all the rest of the body against foreign invaders. But a lot of times our nervous system is insulated from other parts of the body. So for instance, if you have a business and you've got some sort of central computer processing, right? You keep that insulated. You don't allow people physical access to that. It's protected by all kinds of layers of electronic defenses and things like that, right? Because if that goes down, everything goes down. Same thing with the nervous system. So microglia are considered the specific defenses of the nervous system, of the central nervous system itself. And as you can imagine, like the name suggests, they're pretty small. So again, we see in yellow over here, a neuron, a star-shaped neuron. And you can see how the microglia are very small. Ependymal cells. So the ependymal cells, their main function is with CSF. So that is cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid, when we look at the brain, we're going to find that there are actual chambers in the brain that are filled with fluid. And this fluid circulates around the brain and down through and around the spinal cord, giving it a buffer, etc. And these ependymal cells are the cells that make it. And you can see how they often have cilia, and that will cause flow of this fluid that they've created through the cavities and chambers. All right, one of our last ones here are the oligodendrocytes. So the oligodendrocytes also have an important function, kind of look like astrocytes in terms of having different foot-like processes extending out, but these ones have processes extending out that insulate the neurons, and they produce what's called a myelin sheath. And so what they do is, if we're talking about a neuron has a characteristic kind of star pattern. Oh, I am getting you a crazy neuron there. So it has a star-like pattern, and then it has a long process that comes off of it, which is called the axon. And the axon is where, when it's sending a signal, it sends it down the axon. And so, much like wires that are coming out of your computer or something like that, it helps to have those insulated and not have that signal going off in other directions. Ooh, I forgot to put a nucleus in my cell. But that's what this insulation does as well. So that's what you see here. If you see these yellow fibers like that, that's the axon. That's a neurofiber going through the center of it. And these oligodendrocytes are insulating it. They're producing a fat-like material that wraps around it. But notice that while the cell, the soma, if you will, or the cell body is here, they have lots of different extensions insulating numbers of cells. They think that, you always hear how the brain doesn't do a good job of healing, etc., and regenerating. They think that it often has something to do with these oligodendrocytes and how there's this complex network of insulation around different cells, etc. And so these pathways, once they're established, if they're broken, it's hard to regrow them and reestablish them, partially due to, again, this network of oligodendrocytes. All right, so that was our fourth major neuroglia of the central nervous system, and then we have two of the peripheral nervous system. So one are these ones that are called satellite cells. These are similar to the astrocytes in the central nervous system, so they help to kind of surround and support like you saw. And then there are Schwann cells, and the Schwann cells are very similar to the oligodendrocytes. And what do the oligodendrocytes do? They produce myelin sheaths, right? So in this case, though, if we look at them, very different. So here are the satellite cells surrounding the cell body. But if you look here, each of these little sections right here, each of those is the myelin sheath. It's the insulation, but it's also the Schwann cell itself. So one Schwann cell wraps around and around one little section of the axon or the nerve fiber. And so it's a lot less complicated than those oligodendrocytes that have all these different extensions going between all different kinds of cells. And so that often is why they think that in the peripheral nervous system it's easier to regenerate, because it has a more simplified, if you will, structure to it, easier to regrow. Okay, so we've gone through the neuroglia, and so now what we need to lead to is getting to the neurons themselves. So for the neurons themselves, we're going to spend some time looking at their anatomy, the anatomy of the cell. Then we're also going to talk about the different types of neurons. Now they're all neurons, they all conduct signals, but there are different types. Physically there are different types, functionally there are different types depending on where their signals are going, etc. So let's take a look at them. Now this one looks a whole lot better than the one that I drew, but you can still see some similarities, right? So you can see throughout here, so this is where the cell body is, right? So the soma or cell body is right in here. That's where the nucleus is. And you can see there's lots of different extensions coming off of it, right? It's kind of star-shaped, starfish-shaped, if you will, if you're a marine biologist. You can see how there's a bunch of shorter ones. These ones are called dendrites. Effectively, these are kind of the ears of the cell. So they are doing the hearing of the cell, picking up signals from other cells. And then the axon down here is like the mouth. Because once that signal is, they've gathered enough information from the dendrites and gathered it at the soma, kind of like the head, and then we decide to send that signal on, then it's going to go out the mouth, if you will, go out the axon, and then we're going to send a signal of our own that's then going to go down to these what are called axon terminals, right? Terminal means end. There's going to be another star-shaped cell down here, which is going to gather that information and maybe send it on further again. So dendrites extend off of the cell body. They are the receptive part of the cell. When we look at the cell body, there's lots of different organelles in there, like any normal cell, but then we have this long extension that's called the axon, and it might be insulated and it might not. Now this one is insulated. We see our Schwann cells, our individual Schwann cells all along it. So this one is the insulated one. The insulation tends to make those signals go faster. Okay, so when we look at the cell, the star-shaped cell, we saw that there was a cell body or soma, And sometimes those cell bodies can be located in the central nervous system or in the peripheral nervous system. And so if they're in the central nervous system, there's a whole aggregation of them. We call those nuclei. Obviously, the cell itself has a nucleus, but when we take a whole bunch of neuron cell bodies and we gather them together in a cluster, then they also call that a nucleus. If it's in the peripheral nervous system, they call that a ganglion, or multiple ones are called ganglia, like we saw before in that figure. Other things that we see associated with the neurons, there are what are called tracts. So tracts are going to be a bundle of neuron processes in the central nervous system. So like going through the brain or going up and down through the spinal cord, right? Bundles. So not just one cell, but a whole bunch of cells. Imagine, if you will, you had like a big cable, in terms of internet or something like that, and you cut that cable and you look at it, you would see a whole bunch of individual fibers, right, that might be going into your neighborhood or something like that, and then they would split off to the individual houses. Well, the body packages neurons as well, like that, if they're going into particular neighborhoods, like down the upper limb, or to the head and neck, or to a particular area of the face, or something like that. They'll bundle them together. So if it's inside of the brain and spinal cord, we call that a tract. And if it's going out into the body in the peripheral nervous system, that's what we actually call a nerve. So a nerve, like we said, is a bundle of individual neurons or axons of neurons all together going to or from one place in the body. Okay. So, like we mentioned, dendrites are the ears, if you will, of the neuron. And so often there'll be hundreds of those that are collecting this information from all over the place, from lots of different other neurons. And it gathers that information, and if it gets enough stimulus, then it may bring all of that together at the soma of the cell body, and it will trigger the signal to then be relayed down that neuron. And so those signals that it's getting when it's listening are called graded potentials. And every one it gets oftentimes then kind of increases the chance that it's going to send, that receptive cell is going to send a signal of its own. So lots of different branches so that it can communicate to lots of cells. In some cases, they can be very specialized and branching to where they call dendritic spines as well. So they have little spiky ends to them. So you can see that each one of these is a dendrite, but you can see how there are small little spines of them too. The more branches you have, the more connections you can make. It's kind of like LinkedIn, right? Okay, so axon. Remember, the axon is the extremely long one that's coming off of the soma or cell body. So when we looked at that figure, right, the axon was right here. Now you see this kind of connection here, this little area here. That's called the axon hillock. That's where it connects to the soma of the cell body. And that's where, if this receptive cell is going to send a signal of its own, that's where it gathers all of that, if you will, stimulatory or excitatory information, and then releases that signal down the axon itself. Okay, so axon hillock is where it connects together. Like we said, the axon is often known as a nerve fiber as well, and it may branch into what are called axon collaterals. And when they get down to the very end, they branch a lot. So again, they can communicate to lots of different cells or lots of different areas on a cell. Like we talked about the neuromuscular junction, right? You saw those terminals coming down, and it then was connecting along the cell. So, like we said, this is the axon, is basically like the mouth. This is where, if this neuron is going to send a signal, it's going to be sending it down its axon to communicate with another cell. So it goes down the cell membrane, called the axolemma, down to that terminal, down at the very end. Now, we said that there's a synapse. When we get down to those branching terminals, right, there's going to be another cell there. It may be a dendrite of another cell, it may be a muscle cell, but there's always going to be a gap. They're not going to physically touch. So there's this gap in between. So we have an electrochemical signal going down this axon, and then we've got to get that signal across the gap. So much like if somebody was kind of down the road from you and you wanted to communicate with them, you might send them a text or something like that. But if you want to go simply, you might write it on a piece of paper and just throw it across the gap to them. So that's a bit like what happens at that synapse. So we release neurotransmitters or chemicals that will then diffuse across the gap and receive on receptors on the second cell. All right, so most of the movement that we consider goes away from the somatic cell body and it goes down the axon to another cell. So that's called anterograde movement. So that's where, like we were talking about, our signals are going to go that way. But there's also other things that go that way too. So for instance, a lot of the cellular machinery exists up at the somatic cell body, and so that's going to be sent down as well. So mitochondria can be created and sent down there, different cytoskeletal elements, proteins, etc., enzymes and things like that. There is some movement that goes back the other way as well. So if we need to recycle organelles that we've sent downstream, we need to bring them back up to the main manufacturing area. Signal molecules we can reabsorb and things like that. But you can also get toxins that can go up and infect the cell as well. So those are called retrograde, right? Retrograde viruses and things like that. So there's lots of different examples of ones that you may have heard of, right? Polio, rabies, herpes, tetanus. All of those are migrating up. They affect the nervous system and they migrate up in that way. And so now they're trying to kind of engineer them so that maybe viruses can actually go up and have a positive effect instead through that retrograde transport to suppress defective genes, etc. So interesting technology that's developing. All right, so we've been talking a while about nervous system. We've talked about the different cell types, right? The neuroglia and then the neurons. We talked about the different types of neuroglia, 4 in the central nervous system, 2 in the peripheral nervous system, and now we're talking about the anatomy of a neuron. So you need to know the different parts of the neuron and what they do. And now we're going to continue on, and we'll start in the next section talking about insulation, talking about the functional types of neurons, and then ultimately we'll talk about how these neurons do their job of sending signals. But that will wait until the next segment, or maybe the one after that.